Today we're making a simple cold process bar working with common additives, and I'm going to demonstrate some important features that soapers can find helpful here before they discover through trial and error. In this video, we'll contrast how adding clay will change your batter, possible health dangers when working with aloe powder, and a simple demonstration on two different ways to add titanium dioxide and how this changes the look of your finished product. Now this video does contain the full recipe, and you can find more videos like this one and our entire collection of recipes at thermalmermaid.com. The first thing we'll do is make our lye water solution, which needs 6.52 ounces of lye crystals and 18.24 ounces of water. Now typically, I like to speed up the video when I mix the lye because if you like to watch soap making videos, this step is the same over and over again. But here, the camera really captures the fumes for a few seconds and you can clearly see how strong the chemical reaction is. So you can see how important it is to wear a mask and gloves. Now I can feel the heat through my glove from the boiling water, and if I wasn't wearing a mask, the fumes would be choking me. And this happens so fast, and it lasts just a handful of seconds until the lye crystals are completely dissolved. Now since we've only made a few recipes so far in lesson 2, I'm going to show you some very common ingredients that are used in cold process soap making and talk about the properties that would have been helpful to me if I discovered before I made a few batches through trial and error. So in this recipe, we're going to talk about adding clay, some properties about and working with titanium dioxide, how adding ingredients and additives can alter your colors, and a warning about working with finely ground dried aloe powder. Now this is a simple recipe. It yields a 3-pound loaf, and a 3-pound loaf is about the size of a bread mold, so you'll get about 11 bars at 4.5 ounces apiece. Now if you don't want to make that much soap, you can cut the recipe in half and get 5 or 6 bars out of this recipe. Here the oil and the lye water have been set aside to cool. Both are about room temperature and within 20 degrees of each other. I'm going to blend this down to a light trace just long enough until it looks completely emulsified. And that means that a slick, shiny, oily sheen right on the surface should disappear in front of your eyes as you're mixing. The additives that we'll put in are going to thicken the batter, so we don't want to go overboard with mixing it and getting it too thick before we start working with our soap. Here I've just added green clover and aloe fragrance from Nature's Garden. Now this is a light and pleasant fragrance, and it has little impact on the recipe. It does not accelerate or rice the soap. It has no vanilla, so it won't affect the color while the soap is curing. And at the time that I've made this video, these bars have already cured for 2 months, and the fragrance is still just as strong as the day I cut the loaf. So I do recommend this fragrance because it holds very well in the finished product. If you have any questions about this recipe, feel free to come over to our Facebook group at Thermal Mermaid Soap and Bath Making, and we can chat directly about it. Now don't forget to subscribe to this channel now to get more soaping recipes in the future. Now after separating the batter into 3 equal parts, we'll start off by adding in the bentonite clay. Now the clay is only 1 tablespoon in this recipe, and when you're making a luxury spa bar, it's very tempting to add in an extra spoonful or maybe even 2. And there is such thing as putting too much clay into your recipe. 1 tablespoon is sufficient. And if you start to experiment with clay, you'll realize this during the curing process because the final product will be sticky. And if you put in too much, you won't get that real beautiful finished product. The colorant is 1/2 teaspoon of soapberry green mica, and that's already been mixed in with a tablespoon of olive oil. So as we're adding it into the batter, it's already in a liquid form to keep everything nice and smooth. Now we're putting this in with the bentonite clay, which is already kind of a greenish tint, and so the final result in this colorant is going to be a very natural, earthy tone green. In the second part of the batter, dust 1 tablespoon of dried aloe powder. Now if you haven't seen my video when I hand-made this additive, stay tuned for just a minute for an important safety warning about this aloe dust, which wasn't evident to me at the very first time that I was using it. Now I'm adding the exact same amount of colorant, 1 teaspoon of soapberry green dissolved in 1 tablespoon of olive oil, and now as I'm mixing it, you can see that the result is a much brighter green. And that's because the clay actually changed the color of the first batter, and the aloe is a much lighter color, and so we're going to get two contrasting greens but using the exact same color in this recipe. Now in the third part of the batter, I've started off by mixing 1 teaspoon of titanium dioxide into a tablespoon of corn oil and then mixing that into the soap. And you always want to dissolve your white titanium dioxide thoroughly before adding it to the soap. It lightens the soap batter to an off-white, but this will cure a lighter color after some time. This is plenty of titanium dioxide in the recipe for a nice white layer. But since this is one of the first recipes in Lesson 2, you may not have worked with titanium dioxide yet, and you might be tempted to keep adding it until your batter gets to a nice bright white shade. So I'm going to show you what it looks like and what happens to your bar if you add too much and just throw the powder in. Now if you want a bright white bar of soap, there are other ways to do that, which we'll talk about in other recipes, but adding more titanium dioxide is not always the answer. Now you won't ruin the soap itself, but you will get a distinct distorted look. So as you just saw, I threw in another 1.5 teaspoons as a demonstration. And this is double the amount that I ever put into any of my recipes, so I should really get a strong crackling effect at the end of the video, which we'll show you when we cut open the bars. The first layer to pour into the mold is the soap with the aloe. Now I'm saving the clay layer for the center because it tends to harden slower and it can be sticky, so it's easier to unmold the entire loaf after 24 hours with this part at the bottom. Now aloe in its original hydrated state is a thick slimy substance. It's known for having exceptional skin soothing properties, and in fact it's considered to be the world's most widely used medicinal plant. Now what you saw me put in earlier was a completely dehydrated dust that I made by slicing up the pieces and putting it into my dehydrator. The powder is ultra light, and if you aren't careful and it gets jostled around, it can just sit in the air and just linger there. If you breathe the dust, it'll start to rehydrate when it hits the moisture in your lungs. This is not a pleasant feeling. It feels heavy like a wet blanket or a cake of cement in your lungs. So it's important to wear a mask when you're working with the dust, and I would be especially careful around children. Now the center layer of our bar is the batter that has the clay in it. Now this is thick and heavy. It has the same consistency as mud, and it's much heavier than the aloe layer that we've put at the bottom. So I do have to spoon it in very gently to keep it from sinking through the very bottom layer. Now I want this in the center because that has the least amount of contact with the sides of the mold. And since the rest of the soap will harden at a better consistency after 24 hours, if we put it in the center, we can unmold the entire loaf more easily. Now it's time for the third and final layer of our bar. And if you remember, this was our white titanium dioxide layer, where we put in twice as much as we normally would for this recipe. Now, one of the characteristics of putting in a lot of titanium dioxide is that your batter will accelerate and it'll become very thick. Now in this case, the batter is thickening up because it's been sitting for the longest and it's already starting to become very thick. So it's not doing anything unusual or extraordinary, and the consistency and look of it, aside from being really bright white for batter, is pretty normal. Everything looks really good so far. So stick around for just a moment after we top this off and get it set aside for 24 hours, and we'll get this cut open so you can see what it looks like when we have just too much titanium dioxide put into a section of our bar. Now after 24 hours, we're ready to unmold and cut the bars into individual pieces. And one of the first characteristics you'll notice in this top white layer is that the edge is a little bit brittle and crumbles along the side. Now this can happen in a normal loaf of soap, but this is also one of the characteristics when you use too much titanium dioxide. Now cutting the first piece looks okay, but when we look up close at the white layer of soap, you can see that the top has a crackled texture with lots of striations and glycerin rivers. Now this is exactly what happens when you use too much titanium dioxide. You get a dry, crackling look. Now, because I just put the powder directly into the batter, I was expecting to see little clumps of white dots to show you how it doesn't blend as well as the micas do, and those little dots can create little drag streaks that are hard to wash away, but in this case it does look like it blended well enough this time. Now, if you really have your heart set on getting that nice, bright, popping white bar of soap, I have some way better secrets and surprisingly easier than just throwing in more titanium dioxide, because if you use too much, you'll almost always get that off-white colored crackle effect every time, and it won't come out the way you want it to. Now, if you do want this look, that's great, and your soap is perfectly fine. But if you want some better secrets, stay tuned to some later recipes, and we'll show you how to get the effect that you want if you want that bright colored white soap. And here's our finished product after it's been set to cure for about 3 days. Hope you enjoyed this video of the Thermal Mermaid Artisan Soap Maker course. This was lesson 2.5, and if you'd like to find other lessons in this course, hop on over. We're at thermalmermaid.com.